The state of New York didn't just want me dead. They wanted me to be a scientific experiment. If you are hearing my voice, the state has finally had its way. They have strapped me into that wooden chair, tightened the leather, and turned the key. They will tell you I am a monster. They will point to the 5 husbands I buried and the lives I supposedly extinguished. They will say I died the worst woman on earth. But as the smoke clears from this chamber, I need you to know one thing. I am Lizzie Halliday, and I am innocent. And what they are about to do to me is the real crime. The headlines said I would be the first. The chair was prepped, the death warrant was signed, and the world was waiting for the switch to be thrown in 1894. My fate was a certainty, but history took a darker turn. I didn't die in that chair. I did something much worse. History says I began in County Antrim, Ireland. But the truth is, I was born into a soil that had forgotten how to be kind. They say the Great Famine ended in 1852. They are wrong. It just stopped eating the potatoes and started eating the people. In Antrim, the silence wasn't empty, it was hungry. I learned early that the world doesn't give. It only trades, and usually, the price is something you weren't ready to lose. When I reached New York, I wasn't a woman. I was a bad Bridget, a hungry ghost in a silk dress. America didn't want our labor as much as it wanted our disappearances. I learned to blend into the gray of the city. I learned that a name is just a coat. You can take off when it gets too heavy. I was a wife by trade and a widow by habit. In those years, I learned that a marriage certificate is just a contract, and every contract has an expiration date. The first was Charles, natural causes, they said. I remember being surprised that I could cry at the funeral. I think I was crying for the version of me that still cared. Then came the veterans, men with pensions that outlived their usefulness, Brewer, Smith, Plaisdell. Their names started to sound like the same words spoken in different rooms. The doctors in those days were remarkably easy to please. A pale face and a quiet house were usually enough to sign a certificate. George Smith told me the tea tasted off, metallic, like a penny under the tongue. I told him I must have let it steep too long. I sat there and watched him. I wanted to see if the fear would change his eyes. But here's the question history never asked. If I was the monster they claimed, why did I let him live to tell you about the taste? Perhaps I just wanted someone to know that I was capable of it. I was 31. I had no money, 3 dead husbands, and a name that was starting to burn. I needed somewhere the air was too thin for gossip. I needed a fresh start. In the Catskill Mountains, I found Paul Halliday. He was a man too lonely to notice the matches in my hand. He smelled of pipe tobacco and desperation. He was 70 years old. I was 30. I became his wife in 1890. It was the last name I ever intended to use, because by then I didn't just have a motive. I had a method. Paul disappeared in August of 1891. I told the neighbors he had gone to town for masonry work. They waited. He didn't come back. I didn't just milk his cows or tend his land. I sat in his chair. I let the dust settle on his pipe. For 2 years, the farmhouse held its breath, and I held mine. The neighbors watched me through their windows, sensing the rot but lacking the courage to name it. I was alone with the land, and whatever was underneath it. I had been alone in that house for 2 years, with Paul rotting beneath my feet. I decided it was time for company. I reached back to the years after I first arrived in New York, when I had fled my first husband, Charles, in Vermont. I had burned his shop to the ground and disappeared into the night. Margaret and Sarah McQuillan were the only ones who sheltered me in Philadelphia when I was running from an arson charge and a name I could no longer keep. I invited them to the farm to repay that old kindness. I told them the mountain air would do them good. They thought they were visiting an old friend. They didn't know the house was already full with the dead. I gave them a bed for the night. And then I gave them a permanent home in the barn hay. I thought the mountains would keep my secrets, but the air up here is too thin to hide the smell of wood smoke and rot. On September 4th, 1893, the barn went up in flames. The neighbors didn't just come to help. They came with questions. While the fire was still smoldering, they moved the hay and found what I had tucked away. Margaret and Sarah were no longer guests. They were evidence. The law didn't find me through brilliance. They found me through fire. September 1893. The smoke from the barn hadn't even cleared when the law found them. Margaret McQuillan and her daughter Sarah. They were buried under fresh hay, bound like animals. I didn't leave it to chance. I shot Margaret 3 times, once for every year I'd known her. Her daughter only took one right through the head. These were the people who took me in when I was a hungry ghost in the city. I didn't just kill them. I erased them. But the barn was just the prologue. While the neighbors wept over the hay, I was thinking of the kitchen. The smell had already begun to speak for me before they even pried up the floorboards. Paul was there, cramped into the dark earth. I shot him 3 times, once in the chest, once in the shoulder, and the final one through the face. I had to use an axe to make him fit that narrow grave. You see, Paul was a large man, but in the end I made him small enough for the dirt. The Sullivan County Sheriff looked at what I had done and decided the only explanation was Jack the Ripper. The newspapers actually printed it. Jack the Ripper. They needed the Ripper to be someone they had already caught. The world needed a ghost from London because it wasn't ready for a woman from Ireland with a .32 caliber and a shovel. I didn't have the patience for the Ripper's work. A man in an alley is a tragedy, but a woman waiting in your kitchen is a betrayal. We are not the same kind of terrible. They locked me in the Sullivan County Jail and sent the famous Nellie Bly to interview me. She sat across from me with her notepad, looking for a soul. I showed her a mirror. I gave her nothing but the hollow spaces between my lies. When the crowds gathered outside my window to see the worst woman on earth, I gave them the show they paid for. I set fire to my bedclothes just to watch the smoke fill the stone halls. When they took my matches, I used broken glass to open my own throat. I wanted to see if my blood was as cold as they claimed. The sheriff eventually grew tired of my games. He chained me to the floor like a rabid dog for 3 months. When I refused to eat, they forced a rubber tube into my nose, a funnel and a tube. They wanted to keep the monster alive, just long enough to kill it legally. June 1894. Guilty. Death by electricity. I was the first woman in the history of New York sentenced to the electric chair. America was very excited to see how I would burn. They didn't throw the switch. The governor commuted my sentence weeks before the execution. They said killing a lunatic wasn't justice. It was spectacle. So they sent me to Massachusetts State Hospital for the criminally insane, a warehouse for people who had done things the law couldn't categorize. For 12 years, I was a model patient. Compliance is a currency, and I bought their trust. They thought sewing would keep my hands busy. They gave me shears. Her name was Nellie Wicks, a nurse. She was consistent, and she made the mistake of treating me like a human being instead of a document. She called me Lizzie. In that building of screams, it was the only sound that made me feel tethered to the earth. The doctors looked at me and saw a patient. I looked at Nellie and saw a possession. When she announced she was resigning to be married, to go live a life I was not permitted to imagine, I told them exactly what I would do to her. I said it clearly. They wrote it in their notes, and then they decided 12 years of good behavior made me safe. They didn't take the shears. I didn't just find the shears. I waited for them. Metal has a memory, and those blades were tired of cutting fabric. September 1906. I stabbed Nellie Wicks 200 times. They counted the wounds. I kept going long after she was gone, not for money, not for the calculations the prosecution assembled 12 years before, just rage pure, final, and beyond all accounting. They didn't execute me for Nellie Wicks. There was no verdict the system could hand down that it hadn't already tried. So they just kept me same building, same corridors. Whatever was inside me, it was never only money, and no one ever fully explained what it was instead. I died on June 28, 1918, in the gray stone halls of the Massachusetts State Hospital. No execution, no chair, no current through the leather to set my soul on fire. There was no grand finale, just a slow rot in my kidneys that turned my blood to poison from the inside out. My body simply stopped because bodies eventually do. I was the worst woman on earth, and in the end, even the earth didn't want me. Lizzie's story ends in the dirt, but the Bender's story is just starting to bleed. You've seen what one woman can do. Now see what a family of monsters is capable of. Kate Bender's terrifying confession is waiting. Click it now, before the light fades.